What does ESPN's returning production say about the SEC? We'll discuss coming up on Locked On Sooners.
You are Locked On Sooners, your daily podcast on the Oklahoma Sooners. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Sooner Nation? Welcome to Locked On Sooners, and thank you for making Locked On Sooners your first listen every single day. Shout out to all the everydayers out there. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Bill Connolly of ESPN released his annual report on returning production for the 2025 season, and we'll get into what it says about Oklahoma, what it might say about John Mateer coming up in the show. But first, let's just talk about what stood out to you, Jay, in terms of returning production in the SEC.
What's interesting about it is when I looked at the numbers, I went ahead because I put together a spreadsheet from last year that showed the winter production numbers to the spring, because Bill does it for both. Bill Connolly at ESPN is going to have a winter one. He'll have one right after the spring transfer portal, and that's the one that leads into the season, so you can get an understanding of what the teams are going to look like. And there's usually a rise and a fall for a lot of these teams because, when you deal with injuries and you go into the portal and bring somebody else in, it kind of changes those numbers. But just looking at teams going into last season from the spring and the way they're looking here in the winter, there's a lot of massive flip-flops in the numbers, John. When I went through this, I looked at Georgia and Texas, who are both roughly in the 100s as far as returning production, 45% on the returning side, especially on offense, how they lost, their signal callers, Carson Beck leaving as well as Quinn Ewers. But last year, they were both in the top 40 as far as returning production, especially on offense, top 26 for both of them in the spring. And the defenses were, they were okay, but you could tell that they spent a lot in the portal to add talent. And those two right there who are your leaders, that jumped out the most. The second one that jumped out to me was Tennessee. Tennessee was in the 100s, and not only offense, but defense and overall going into last season, and still finished with 10 wins. That's huge. If you're really thinking about the numbers and how this all works, this is a conversation that, to me, I'm intrigued what your thoughts were looking at those numbers and just kind of how they reflect in comparison to the way these teams performed.
Yeah, it's fascinating because so much of what we're seeing now, the transfer portal changes the dynamic on a lot of this. A team like Tennessee, they didn't have big time returning production, but they had some really good talents, some blue chip prospects that were stepping into big time roles, like Nico Iamaleava. Like, he was taking over as the starting quarterback. You had different guys. They added a big time offensive tackle in the transfer portal, if I remember right. And Josh Heupel was able to get that defense playing at a really, really high level and get the offense schemed around what they did well, which was play defense and run the football. And so this is where the coaching aspect a lot of this comes from is, maybe Tennessee wasn't as talented as some of these other teams in the SEC. We saw it again in the college football playoff against Ohio State. They were definitely not talented enough to take on the national champion. Mm-hmm. But with solid coaching, good coaching, and understanding what your team can do at its best, you can overcome some of the quote-unquote talent deficiencies or the experience or the lack of experience that you might have for a season. And here's the other part of this, the schedule definitely plays a difference in this. You might not be the most talented football team, but if you've got a nice, light schedule, you might be able to overcome it and get 10 wins and get to the college football playoff. You might be the most talented football team in the country, but you have a schedule like Florida's or Oklahoma's, and you might end up 7-5 or 8-4 or 9-3, and on the outside looking into the playoffs. So the returning production piece, I do think matters. I think one of the aspects that matters the most is, what do you have at quarterback? Because we've seen how transfer portal quarterbacks can make such a huge difference to teams. Just this last year with Will Howard and Riley Leonard going to the national championship game, Dylan Gabriel running Oregon undefeated through the regular season and the Big Ten championship game. You see transfer portal quarterbacks making a big impact. Jackson Dart. I mean, he was there in year 2 with Ole Miss, but he was a transfer portal quarterback that made an impact on that team. And this will feed our discussion on John Mateer later, but where you land portal additions makes a big difference. And some of these teams that landed offensive tackles, the premier offensive tackles, or the premier edge rusher, like a South Carolina with Kyle Kennard, or Oklahoma bringing in Dominic Williams last year. Those kind of things matter, and that helps influence that returning production, because Bill Connolly does take into account portal additions and what it might mean for teams bringing those experienced snaps over.
Yeah, and Bill even talked about in the article that returning production is lower than ever here in 2025. That's like one big headline on this article that he wrote, as he's been building this over the last few weeks. And very intriguing thing though, John, looking at this, he pointed out that we're now at roughly the end of the COVID era players, the ones with the extra years. Like this would be the last year for a lot of those players, that if you were a 2020 recruit and you got that addition and you had that COVID year and then you redshirted the next year or within that time, you're now done. This is probably the last year of teams that have a lot of returning aged players, but this is the lowest. It's at 53% is the national average this year, which is down a good 6% from last year overall. So you're seeing a lot less returning talent this year in comparison to before, and I think that is the play, like you mentioned. It's about the fact that a lot of these teams are getting transfer players in. And so because of that, that kind of skews some of your numbers, because you also are losing players like Georgia. Their offense is so low mainly because their starting quarterback has just transferred over to another school, similar to Texas. It's Arch Manning show now that, with Quinn Ewers being gone, but like Vanderbilt, look at them. They're number 8 in the country right now, 70% overall returning production, with both offense and defense being at 68% or more, which is crazy. So that means that this season they should make a huge jump. Same thing with Texas A&M. They're both over 70. They're in over 70% overall offense and defense. They're top 20 in all 3 of those. That should make them dangerous. But you make the perfect point. It's going to be all dependent upon what your quarterback play looks like. Can your quarterback lead you? Is Marcel Reed ready to do that? We got that exact same question now with John Mateer, and that was talked about in the article. We'll talk about that here in the next segment. But what your quarterback play does for you is going to matter the most. It doesn't matter how many snaps they have. We know that some quarterbacks will play at multiple teams and have tons of snaps that they're returning from the year before, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to handle it at that particular team. We're seeing that a lot here in the SEC as well. So the question's going to be, who's going to be able to take advantage of these production numbers that they have in front of them and be successful? Missouri showed that they were able to. They were number 10 in offense last year, 17th overall returning production, and they saw a boost in the game. This coming year, they're going from 5th in defensive returning production, but 100 in offense. So basically, Eli Drinkwitz is starting over on offense. Does that mean that they're going to be worse next season or not? Ole Miss, that dramatic jump from 23rd to 113th overall. To me, it's going to be terrifying. But heck, Auburn was solid coming in. I mean, Auburn was 19th in returning production on offense. I mean, Oklahoma, 3rd in defense. Now, the defense did show up. We know the Sooners' defense showed. Offense didn't, but it was 114th. That was the thing, the offensive line with the inexperience. So it's going to be about quarterback. It's also going to be about that offensive line. Will those two be able to come out and produce going into next year?
I find it fascinating that Texas comes in at number 103 overall, 126 on offense, and 44 on defense. Again, Texas is losing a lot of talent and putting a lot on Arch Manning's shoulders for 2025. We're going to talk about what all this might mean for the Oklahoma Sooners coming up next. Also, is John Mateer going to be the real deal? We'll discuss coming up here on Locked On Sooners.
March basketball is here, and there's no other better place to get into action than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you pick more or less on at least two players' projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. That's right. It's fast, easy, and keeps every game exciting. So like building a lineup. I'm looking at the games for tonight. You got Luka Doncic at 30.5 points. Definitely would take that more. Him and Austin Reeves, who's putting up 28.5 points, rebounds, and assists combined. Why would you not take the more on that one? The Lakers are cooking, and you're seeing some good stuff out of Luka Doncic, and he's getting a revenge game against Dallas. So you can do Kyrie Irving, 26.5, probably take less. But it's really easy. It takes you about 60 seconds to put together a roster, and boom, you can stay engaged in the game all game long. So download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONCollege and get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
Thanks again for making Locked On Sooners your first listen every single day. Shout out to all the everydayers out there. Tune in and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. So, Jay, what does all this returning production mean for the Oklahoma Sooners? Because they come in as the number 6 offense, number 44 defense, 46 defense, number 6 offense. Sorry.
Yep, that's okay.
Just crazy. And here's the first takeaway. All of that offensive line production that you had last year, all the snaps, is back, except for Michael Tarkin and Spencer Brown. And that's it.
Yeah. Even the little bit you got from Gary and Hatchett in the first couple of games. I mean, he transferred back to Washington, but that immediately got changed when you brought in more players. Branson Hickman is back, right? Like, he's not even listed as someone that's entering the NFL draft because he's one of the COVID kids. He's got one more year left that he can, continue to play. So, no, the biggest thing is, can the offensive line come out and produce? Now, granted, we know that the line improved as the season continued. We saw some growth from a lot of the young players. Well, they're going to be back. They are back. Like you mentioned, you've only got certain players that are bounced, and then bringing in a transfer like a Derek Simmons, which I'm hearing in practices that they're surprised that he's as good as he was. They were hoping to have him as a depth piece. Sounds like he's battling out there for a chance to actually start. Him and, some of the young players like Michael Fasusi and Ryan Fogier with the others. The offensive line's going to be most important. That's going to be key and critical. And Bill Simmons even talks about that in there. And I think the one thing that jumped out to me is with the defense being at 46, I was a little concerned, John. I was like, all right, what's Brent Venables going to do with that? You had 3 last year. So bringing in that much defensive talent returning should be exciting. Well, Bill made this statement, and I really want to get your thoughts on that. Thoughts on this. He says there's the 2025 defense could be outstanding, returning 11 of 19 guys with 200-plus snaps and adding among the brightest talents from disappointing Florida State and Marvin Jones Jr. and Oklahoma State, Kendall Daniels defenses. So they brought in 2 guys that were probably the brightest spots on their team's defense, and their defense just was meh, without them. We added additional productive defenders. To me, it makes me feel like that 46 ain't going to be as bad and as low as you think it's going to be. It makes me feel like the defense will probably jump up even better than last season.
Well, I think it should be at least as good as it was last season.
Mm-hmm.
You can't account for the loss of Danny Stutsman, big-time leader on and off the field, big-time producer. Same with Ethan Downs, big-time leader. Those are intangible things that you have to replace. They've got guys that they've been developing for years now. Kobe McKenzie, Kip Lewis, R. Mason Thomas, Grayson Halton. They've been in the program. They've been in the system for years now. They're entering their 4th year with Oklahoma, so they should be ready to take that next step. But it's hard to just one-for-one replace a guy like Danny Stutsman and Billy Bowman and Ethan Downs. You hope that you can get a little bit higher ceiling from a pass rush perspective from a guy like Marvin Jones Jr. You hope that bringing in a Kendall Daniels helps to provide some experience and solidify the linebacker room a little bit more. And then the rest of the defense is cooking, man. You've got a really good foundation on defense. Now you just got to figure out the cornerback spot. We talked about that earlier this week, that cornerback was the place that was the weakest link. And if you got answers at cornerback, then the defense would be ready to roll, because you bring back a lot of the core of what made this defense so good last year. And that's in the front seven and in the safety room. Sure, you lost guys that are going to the NFL. You're going to do that every year, but you're bringing back a large majority of the guys that were productive for this defense in Jaden Jackson, Grayson Halton, R. Mason Thomas, Dominic Williams. And then you bring in a guy like Marvin Jones Jr. to throw out there on the other side of the defensive line, opposite of R. Mason Thomas. And you've got the potential to have two really good bookend pass rushers. And if you can unlock everything that Marvin Jones Jr. was projected to be coming out of high school, you could get what South Carolina had with Dylan Stewart and Kyle Kennard.
Yeah, you really could. And coming from that, like last year, number 3 in defense, 86% coming back. This year, we're returning 60% so far because we haven't hit the spring portal yet. So if we do add an additional like secondary player, an additional linebacker, those numbers could even change and improve. But the offense is going from 114th at 44% returning production to 78% returning production, which you bring back all those offensive snaps. You're not bringing in a quarterback that hasn't played at the collegiate level or played against good defenses. I mean, John Mateer had played against Washington. We saw him, put up some numbers against Boise State. He's done some things, so he's actually been able to see some competition in front of him. I think that that's going to be a pretty big indication of how Oklahoma plays because, again, that offensive line is going to be so critical, and I think that we are probably have that figured out going in. We've seen – The good thing is that the offensive line has felt what it's like playing in the SEC so far. Mm-hmm. Majority of the guys there know what it's like going against those dudes. They know how you need to prepare for it. They know how hard it's going to be as far as the strength you're going to be dealing with, the moves, all of that. That Alabama game to me is basically the game that I know a lot of these players are going to refer back to of. That's the type of offensive line play we need to have week in and week out. Regardless of who you play, that's how you should always play. And I think the offensive lines, I think Bill Beatonbow is going to instill that into him. I think Schmitty's going to as well. He's going to say, look, that's how tough you guys were for that game. Why don't you continuously do that week in and week out? Because you'll have the opportunity because you'll have more experience compared to the competition going into next year. So I think that that's probably where the measuring stick is going to be for this squad.
Yeah, so much of it's going to rely upon the offensive line and their development to be successful. Now, again, you're bringing back a good defense. So we're not asking the offense to go from being one of the worst offenses in college football to being number 1. Obviously, that would help, and that would make them a legit contender. But if they can just get to 30 to 35 points per game, it gives them an opportunity to increase their win total to 8 or 9 or 10. Again, big ifs, because you got to gel that offensive line. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of parts that are blue chip prospects, highly regarded transfer additions, guys you brought in this class and in the last class that you need to see take those steps to becoming starting offensive linemen at the SEC level. But you've got some foundational building blocks that you can work with to figure that out. Will they figure it out? Hopefully they figure it out a lot better than they did last year, because last year was a train wreck. And if we're expecting John Mateer to come do big things for Oklahoma, he's going to need a little help around him. And this is where the wide receiver additions, I think, are important too, because you bring in guys like Giovanni Gibson and Keontez Lewis, who have a lot of experience, albeit at a lower level of college football. That experience matters for something, and it's going to be impactful, as opposed to no, this is not to slight JJ Hester or LV Bunkley Shelton, but they came from, group of or Power 5 programs, but they hadn't done anything. And they came to Oklahoma and they didn't do anything. So we can get excited about a bunch of Power 5 additions that didn't produce somewhere just because they were Power 5 additions. Or we could look at a guy like Giovanni Gibson who did produce somewhere and say, hey, maybe they could try to replicate something like that at the SEC level with the right quarterback. So we think Oklahoma's got the right quarterback, the guy that can lead the way. How much is it going to matter for Mateer? Coming up next here on Locked On Sooners. Thanks again for making Locked On Sooners your first listen every single day. Shout out to all the everydayers out there. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So in everything that people are looking forward to with the 2025 season, one of the things that keeps coming up, whether it's on our show, national broadcasts, national publications, the Locked On SEC Squad show that you'll hear later this week, where they talk about the transfer they're most excited about seeing. Several people pointed to John Mateer as the guy that they're most looking forward to watching. So make sure you tune in for that one Thursday afternoon, evening when that drops. But John Mateer is very much going to be the key, or maybe 1A to Oklahoma's success in 2025.
I'd say if he's not 1A, he can be a standalone one, because as we talked about in the last segment, the offensive line is also going to be critical to make sure that he has the ability. But even ESPN talked about it in one of the articles about some of the things that they're excited about. And kind of that key thing around Mateer was that a lot of them are in on the John Mateer experience. They're ready to see him do similar to what he did last year. And with him having better talent around him, no shade to the Washington State players whatsoever, but he's going to have more talent around him. He thrives better in situations where his quote-unquote back is against the wall. I mean, it sounds pretty familiar to someone that we know that played at Oklahoma, that was known for having a chip on his shoulder all the time. But that was a few quarterbacks that came into Oklahoma. All the transfers that came in and walk-ons, a lot of them had that chip on their shoulders of, I need to prove to you all I am as good as I know I am. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, you get these quarterbacks that go out there and produce and throw up some numbers. Well, Mateer has that opportunity to do that a second time with better talent in a tougher conference to really prove that he is as good as he thinks he is, not even just what everybody else is. And so the ESPN, writers are saying that's the one experience they expect to be off the charts, and they expect him to really show up and show out. So I'm kind of in the same boat. Like, I just need him to be competent. He's probably going to turn the ball over a lot too. That's probably the thing we need to be prepared for. But I think he's going to be competent enough to where the defense can still lead the way.
Yeah, I don't know if he will turn the ball over a lot. I just don't know that they're going to struggle to get guys open as much.
I don't think it's that. I think he's a gunslinger, though. I just kind of think that he's going to be one that takes a lot of risk.
Well, and listen, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the guys launching a ball down the field. And listen, every once in a while you throw a deep ball, it's going to get picked off. That's just part of it. It's some of the other turnovers that are unreasonable. The fumbles. A guy that runs as physically as he does can't fumble the football. Are you going to throw a pick? Yeah, you might throw 8 picks. It sucks. Nobody likes interceptions. But if you're throwing for 3 touchdowns and interception, I don't think we care. If you're throwing for 250, 3 touchdowns and a pick, and you win, nobody cares. You're going to see some of that stuff. But I just want my guy to throw the ball downfield. Give his guy a chance. You can't complete a pass if you hold on to the ball.
And that is very true. And that's the one thing I don't expect out of John Mateer is I don't expect to see a bunch of fumbles or quote-unquote silly turnovers, like ones where there's like a panic or it didn't make any sense to make this move. I think that if his turnovers happen, it's tip passes because of aggressive throws, trying to get the ball down the field, move the ball. And just as you said, I have no problem with that either. I just want to kind of put the warning out there. I'm just going to say it now here. This is February 25th. I want you all to hear that I did say this up front, that I do think that John Mateer is going to push the ball a lot and potentially get turnovers. But again, that's not a bad thing. You want a guy that's going to have that aggression to want to will your team to wins. I want someone to put the team on their back and say, I got you. We're going to try to carry your way through it. He may see a lot more success than failures, mainly because, John, that defense is going to probably once again carry us. And now that Brent Venables is calling the plays like full time, there's a chance that the focus is going to be, look, I'm going to do everything I can play call wise to make sure that this defense is in the right positions to get the ball back to the offense. If we can turn the ball over on a regular basis like we did the last couple of years and give our offense the ball back and then they can kill clock, John, that could be the game changer. We saw it against Bama. We saw it against LSU. We saw it against Missouri. We could do it. It was all about the quarterback just finishing the play, and we just couldn't do that. I think John Mateer can be that guy, and he can get it done.
Yeah, there's a saying in basketball, shooters shoot. And if you have a gunslinger for a quarterback, you don't want him holstering the gun. You want him to pull it out and use it in the Western. Like the gun doesn't show up in the Western unless it's going to get used. And you want John Mateer to use his all the weapons he's got in his arsenal. You want him to use that. And listen, is he going to make some throws that you're going to be like, "Whoa, that was close." Make you scratch your head a little bit. Yeah, but he's also going to make some great throws that you're like, yeah, that's why you push the ball down the field and you take a chance. It's, again, like the old Wayne Gretzky adage, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. If you don't throw the ball, you can't complete the pass. So I'm fine with it. It's just the ball security when you're running. It's the ball security in key situations. That's the stuff that I think is going to be a difference from what we saw last year at quarterback. And again, having that experience of going through a full season of college football, having the success that he had, even some of the failures that he had, all of that's going to inform his development this offseason where, listen, again, close to 4,000 total yards, 44 total touchdowns. You want to talk about the schedule? Fine. Right. What was Baker Mayfield playing against before he came to Oklahoma? Jalen Hurts wasn't the passing quarterback that he was before he came to Oklahoma. Was he an okay quarterback? Sure. Could he lead Alabama to some wins? Absolutely. But he wasn't throwing the ball quite like he was when he got to Oklahoma. So
agreed.
You can continue to develop, right? It's a developmental game. And I think John Mateer is going to provide a lot of highs for this Oklahoma offense next season. And it's going to be a situation where I don't think the defense is going to have to carry the team. There are going to be some games where John Mateer just balls out and the defense is allowed to give up 20 points and it not be a nail biter at the end.
Yeah, and that's going to be the critical part, is making sure that you do as much as possible to try to eliminate as many nail biters as possible. And also eliminate the ability for the refs to really influence the game. Mm-hmm. Like, don't rely on them to make a call. Don't rely on them to make a pass interference call in the end zone. You do that by making sure that you get down there and you take care of the ball and you don't allow the other team to score. That's something that's going to be critical for Oklahoma this coming season, and I think that we're going to get to that point. We did really good defensively. For the most part, we weren't giving up stuff. Most of our points we were giving up was because of turnovers, and they were all silly turnovers. I don't think we'll see the same silly turnovers this coming season as we saw all through last year. So that's going to be one thing that we'll see dramatic change on. Plus, we'll actually have an OC that will design plays to get receivers open. And having 7 new wide receivers and a lot of changing and shifting around the wide receiver room, I expect hands to be a heck of a lot better in comparison. Plus, we got a lot of size, too. So you got some bigger dudes. You got some fast guys. They're big and fast. You got some guys that are just big. You've got some players that, come in a slot and they can be good in motion and be really good in space. So you've got the plethora of veterans to really young players. And then, of course, the ones in between that we've already had. So, John, when I look at the way the roster is looking now, and of course, as winter workouts are going on, we're hearing stuff, stuff's are rumbling. We talked about it last show about some wide receivers that, sounds like that they may be showing up. They may be surprising people. That's all we need. If we can get more of that throughout the year and continue to develop the young players, we'll be arguing for Emmett Jones getting raised.
Well, wide receiver and offensive line kind of got put on notice in the transfer portal and in the recruiting class. Got to go earn your keep at this point. And also, man, why I feel like at this point, defensive pass interference in the end zone is almost as egregious of a comment to bring up on the show as a squib kick.
Yeah.
Dude, man, just when I think I'm over Drake Stoops and the no call in the end zone, you remind me that I'm not over it. And here we are over 3 years later. Jay, come on, man. I was having a perfectly good show.
You
You're gonna bring
were.
up Drake
I'm
Stoops
sorry.
and the DPI, and I'm about to get fired up on social media all over again. And that's gonna do it for today's episode of Locked On Sooners. Thanks so much for tuning in and being a part of the show. Subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're free and available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. So hit that subscribe button and that notification bell to let you know when new episodes drop. Follow Jay at Unfair Sports. Go check out his channel on YouTube, Unfair Sports. You can follow me at John9Williams. You can also read my work covering the Sooners over at SoonersWire.com. But until next time, he's Jay Smith. I'm John Williams. We'll talk to you then. Boomer.
Sooner.
Long live
me,
Drake
John.
Stoops.
Don't kill me, John.
Forever Drake Stoops.